I'm Carole Taylor. On this episode of Journal, we try to untangle the complicated, twisted world of transit. I think most people would agree that good transit makes for a livable city or region and also helps with affordability. So when TransLink announced that by June of this year, they would be running a $600 million deficit and would have to start cutting service, it got my attention. Already, there are some routes where the bus is full by the first stop, others where service is too infrequent to be useful. So more people, less service, and a huge deficit. Even more surprising was trying to figure out who is actually driving the bus, who is responsible for a regional transit plan, and is there one? Since the business plan is obviously broken, who has the authority to fix it? TransLink, the organization that announced it was in trouble, has its own board of directors, but it isn't exactly independent. The Mayor's Council on Regional Transportation over at Metro Vancouver must approve their budget. But, and it's a big but, they can't tell TransLink how to spend the money. Ultimately, it comes down to the provincial government. In an attempt to staunch the bleeding, the EB government promised $312 million in operations funding, which will give TransLink stable funding for 2 years. At best, this has been described as a Band-Aid, not a long-term solution. Mayor Brad West is the chair of Metro Vancouver's Mayor's Council on Regional Transportation. He's very aware of the weaknesses inherent in the overlapping governance model and has some thoughts on the need for a long-term solution. The mayor joins us after this break. Mayor Brad West is with us to talk about transit. And I have to tell you, Brad, when I started to figure out all the players and all the pieces, I became more confused. And I think that you have said the whole model looks a little bit like it was designed in Frankenstein's lab.
Well, you can absolutely be forgiven for not quite knowing where all the pieces are because I'm quite involved in that. I still don't know that I know. You know, it was originally fairly straightforward. You had BC Transit that continues to operate transit in the rest of the province. And then you had TransLink that was created in the late 90s, and it had responsibility for transit in Metro Vancouver. But what has happened since then is a real evolution. And where we are now is we have a number of people who are at the party and each have different responsibilities. Some of them overlap. You have the provincial government who's always the biggest player in the room and ultimately has the power and the decision making. You have the Mayor's Council, which I chair, that has a very small piece of the pie, really responsible for trying to lay out a long-term plan of what is required for our region. And then you have the TransLink Board of Directors, which are really responsible for oversight in the day-to-day operations of TransLink. So amongst all those parties, and we can't forget our friends in Ottawa, they show up to the party every once in a while with a little bit of money. You know, that has really been the situation for several decades now. And it does lead to this question of who's in charge and who gets to make the ultimate decision about, you know, what projects are happening and what type of services provide to people.
You know, when you say you're the chair of the Mayor's Council on Regional Transportation, that sounds pretty powerful. Because mayors, they represent all of the community. And to think that you're sitting at a table with all those folks that know their constituents and they know what the needs are, but you're saying you don't have as much power as I thought you had.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it sounds powerful because it really isn't. You know, my responsibility is to bring the mayors together and to have their input to produce a plan that is reflective of what we're hearing in our communities. And to the credit of the mayors, we've done that. You know, you think about it, there's a lot that people can't agree on, but the one thing we have agreed on unanimously as 23 mayors in the region is a plan that really speaks to the transit needs in every single city in Metro Vancouver. And so we came together, we were tasked by the provincial government. They say, come up with a plan of what's required for our region. And so we did that over a period of time.
How detailed is that plan? Is it just service or is it finance? What is it?
It really talks about the service that's required. And so it's reflective of what we're seeing in our communities. As you know, the region has changed by leaps and bounds over the last number of years. We have gone through a period of unprecedented population growth. I give lots of speeches on transit, and it used to be that I would go and say, if you can believe it, we're going to add a population equivalent to the city of North Vancouver every single year, which is about 50-ish thousand people. Well, when the stats came out, in 2023, we added over 114,000 people to Metro Vancouver in a single year. And unfortunately, our transit service, our infrastructure, and this is true of many services, has not kept pace with that growth at all. And so you're seeing a system that is under strain, and you're seeing things that used to be aberrations becoming a common occurrence. Bus is too full, so they pass you up. Not able to get onto the SkyTrain system because there's too many people in it. So that has been the reality that people on the ground who are using the system are experiencing. The other thing it does is it keeps people who otherwise may want to use the system from doing so because it doesn't work with their lives. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And for the mayors, it can be frustrating because we're tasked with, again, producing a plan that will provide the service that's required. And we did our job. The hard part, of course, is the financing of the plan. And that's where you need the provincial and federal government at the table. And they have been very reticent to produce, the level of funding and come together with the level of cooperation that's required to take that from being just a plan that's sitting on, a shelf somewhere to becoming people's everyday reality, which is what we actually need.
So that I understand the details of your plan, would you say, well, we'll need this many buses or we need these routes, or what kind of things are you discussing?
So it does get down to a level of that specificity. So identifying where the growth areas are in the region. And I think most people will realize that in our region, the significant growth has been in the south of the Fraser area, in the Langley area, in the area of Surrey. Also in my neck of the woods, in the Tri-Cities and Maple Ridge, there has been a shift eastward in population growth. And so the plan is reflective not of what people may think population growth and development looks like, but what it actually is in our region based on today's reality. And so it's not only people, it's economic centers, it's businesses, and making those connections. And so a large number of new bus routes, more connectivity to where people are going. Because I think one of the things we've seen coming of the COVID pandemic is that the days of everyone living in the outer suburbs, coming into downtown Vancouver for work and then going back home, those days are over. And it is not reflective of the reality today. It's much more complicated. Someone may be living in Port Coquitlam and working in Langley. Someone may be living in Surrey and working in the North Shore. This region is far more connected and complex than it has been in the past, and we need to ensure that the transit system is reflective of that. So it is into that level of specificity of what we require.
So you've got this lovely, beautiful plan. You hand it to TransLink, do you? Mm-hmm. And then does TransLink follow your plan?
Well, therein lies the rub. So I think to their credit, TransLink would like to be able to follow the plan because they're in the business of providing transit service and they like to be able to do that. But TransLink is very reliant upon a funding model that is not anywhere near up to the task of delivering what's required today. It has not changed since TransLink was originally created. And this is going to be a serious challenge that needs to be figured out and figured out quickly. They are very reliant upon three sources of revenue. Gas tax, and that is a declining source of revenue. Every single year, the amount of revenue they're getting out of gas tax is reducing. And because the provincial government has said, well, by 2035, we're not selling any new gas-powered vehicles, you can see that that's going to continue that decline. Fares. Fares is the other source of revenue that they're reliant upon. And there's a lot of sensitivity to fares. If you increase the fares too much, people will not be able to afford to take the system, or they'll avoid it. And the provincial government also has various social goals they wish to accomplish. And sometimes they'll use the transit fare system to do that. For instance, they recently said, we're going to have free transit for children under the age of 12. That has a financial impact. And then the final piece is property taxes. And this is an area where mayors are very concerned, because property taxes are already being hit for everything under the sun. Cities have big infrastructure bills, big demands on them, and cities are entirely reliant upon property taxes. So if you say, okay, property tax owner, not only are you going to be responsible for funding all these municipal needs, guess what? You're going to be the primary funder of the transit system as well. You can see the challenge.
On that note, I think that we'll take a break, catch our breath, because I know when you say property tax, I don't know how you're doing, but Vancouver's had huge property tax increases in the last couple of years. So we'll talk about solutions in a sec. Mayor Brad West, I should have given you a chance to say, how are your taxes in Port Coquitlam?
Well, Carole, I wouldn't be doing my job as mayor if I didn't tell you that Port Coquitlam actually has the lowest average property taxes of the 21 cities in Metro Vancouver. And people can Google that and verify it. It is, in fact, true. We work very hard on our budget. It's probably the most important job we have as council. So it is a process where we go through it with a fine-tooth comb, looking for every savings, every efficiency we can find, but also keeping very focused on the core responsibilities of the municipality, the things that people actually send their tax dollars to City Hall for.
And so I think saying we should increase property taxes, it's so uneven, because they can't go after you just because you've done a good job of keeping it down. So what are the other instruments that could be used to raise money? Is road congestion tax, is that gone?
Well, it seems so. The Premier, as recently as last week, stood up in the legislature and he said that the province would not consider road pricing, his words, as a funding mechanism for TransLink. That is a mechanism that is used in many transit systems around the world. It can look different. There's different types of road pricing mechanisms that exist. But the Premier has said that that's not going to happen. What he says is important, because ultimately it is the provincial government that will have to make this decision. People, mayors, others can have all sorts of suggestions, do this, do that, but the power rests with the province. They control TransLink, they control the legislation, and they set out in legislation how TransLink raises its money. So they have committed that there will be a new revenue source for TransLink, because I think they understand that right now this has been a process of kicking a can down the road every couple of years, and there's no more road left. There has to be something to replace what is declining. What they have not said is what that thing is going to be. People have talked about sales tax, a portion of the sales tax, because it captures those who are visitors to Vancouver, who will use the transit system while they're here, but don't own property here. People have talked about vehicle levies. People have talked about...
A vehicle levy is when you renew your license, there's a $30 charge or something.
And it would be part of your car insurance. So you renew your auto insurance, and there's a portion of that which would go to fund transit. It does show you how in British Columbia everything is cyclical, because in a twist of history, there was a vehicle levy that was proposed for TransLink back in the late 90s. And there was a fair bit of public pushback. George Pule, a city councillor from Vancouver, was one of the architects of it. And the province said they were going to do it until the last minute. And it was a young cabinet minister by the name of Mike Farnworth, who was minister at the time, who said it's not going to happen. And the province killed it. And here we are in 2025, and the province is saying we really need to have a new revenue source for TransLink. And one of the ideas that seems to be out there is a vehicle levy. And the Minister of Transportation today is Mike Farnworth. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the next year.
It looks to me, Brad, as if it's more than just the financial side of it. I mean, the governance side just looks like a mess to me. And they probably should do a complete relook at transit for the region and who's going to have the final say and how it's all going to integrate, rather than you guys sitting over here and you say, okay, well, you've handed us this budget and that's all we can do is say yes or no. Yeah. So you say yes to the budget and it goes over here. And then the province got huge accolades for their $310 million top-up, but it's a $600 million deficit. Yeah. And this is just patching up what's there. It's not fixing it going forward.
Yeah, you're totally correct. I think when you have an agency, an entity as important as TransLink that, you have hundreds of thousands of people in this region depend upon, when the governance system has nobody really in charge, you start to have problems. Someone ultimately has to have responsibility for delivering for people. And so we have been advocating for a fairly significant governance overhaul of TransLink. And of course, as mayors, our bias is that, the voices that are closest to the people who are using the system and who are funding the system should be the people who have much more responsibility for decision making and can be accountable to the public as well. And so we're going to have discussions with the provincial government about that over the next year. And I'm hopeful that a year from now, the governance as it currently stands is going to change significantly.
One of the stories I heard was that the council, Mayor's Council, wanted to put washrooms in the various transit stops. Did that go anywhere?
Well, this again, I think, is a perfect example of the challenge and frustration, quite frankly, that mayors feel. Because we'll hear from our residents or people who are using the system that, one of the reasons they are reticent to jump on a SkyTrain is that almost none of our SkyTrain stations have washrooms, something just basic requirement. And if mayors said, hey, we think this is important, this needs to get done, the current governance system gives us no authority or ability to affect that change. That's a decision of TransLink and the board that oversees them. So, it is a small example, and there are many, of where mayors are identifying needs in the community based on feedback, but we don't have the ability to act upon it. And that is a frustrating situation.
And it also makes it impossible really to have innovative, grand ideas. Like, I've always looked at the South Fraser train notion and wonder why we're not using that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, non-reinventing of the wheel that could occur. The interurban rail system, which operated successfully in this region and province for, many, many years and now sits dormant. I think, again, we need to have our thinking be reflective of reality, reflective of the people who we're trying to serve. It's easy to get a bunch of policy wonks together and lock themselves in a room and come up with the perfect system as the way they think it should operate. But whether it's transit, in my view, just about any government service, it should be reflective of reality and the people we're trying to serve. And it doesn't always have to be, the flashiest, most complicated thing. Sometimes there's some simple things that will serve people, and they're right in front of our nose.
And so it's good if the province has said they're going to re-look at everything, but that's often behind closed doors. How can we, the people, participate in saying what we think transit should look like or what services we need? Is there a system for that?
Well, there is an opportunity for public input through the Mayor's Council process. I would say the Mayor's Council, of all the different entities and bodies that are involved, the Mayor's Council is the one that is most public facing and has integrated opportunities for public feedback. We have people come to our meetings. When we did our plan, which is called the Access for Everyone plan, that involved extensive stakeholder outreach and public feedback. Because again, as mayors, being very close to what's happening on the ground, we want this system to work for the people who actually need to use it or want to use it. I would say that people should raise their voices, though, to the provincial government. You know, it does seem to be the reality that the province reacts to fires that start burning. So if they start hearing from a lot of people in this region that transit system as it is currently devised is not meeting their needs, if they start hearing from people, then I think maybe we'll get some change.
We'll take that advice and remember, so the Mayor's Council or the provincial government are the places to be heard, because I'm sure everybody has an opinion about transit in this region. Thank you, Brad, so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Back in a moment. A visionary, comprehensive regional transit system would do so much good. Reduce car usage and congestion emissions, support housing affordability by allowing families to live further from downtown's high prices, and yet get to work in a timely manner. Two big problems, though. We don't have a financing model that works, nor do we have a governance model that works. Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.